A conversation on the 1984 Sikh genocide is always a difficult conversation, but I believe that it is important at the same time. I'd like to apologize to you for any duress that being here may cause you. I'd like to start by acknowledging the native land of Munsi, Lenape, and Wapingar, also known as Stamford, Connecticut, from where I am joining you today. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Amy Sterczewski, my program director at OMA, and my thesis supervisor, whose guidance and support has made this academic journey possible. My professor for human rights, Professor Zoe West, is also here, and I'm really grateful. For those of you who may not know about the background and context of this spate of killings involving the Sikhs in 1984, I'd like to give you a quick snapshot. On 31st October 1984, the Prime Minister of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, was killed by her Sikh bodyguards at her official residence in Delhi. This followed her ordering the Indian Army to storm the holiest place of worship of the Sikhs, the Golden Temple in Amritsar, Punjab, to take out a rustic preacher who had become a renegade. The army operation badly damaged the Golden Temple complex and hurt Sikh religious sentiments across the globe, and they vowed to take revenge. Personally, I consider Mrs. Gandhi's assassination by her bodyguards an act of treachery. But what followed was worse. Mrs. Gandhi's political party, the Congress, under the leadership of her son and successor, decided to teach the Sikhs a lesson. So over the next 3 days, more than 5,000 Sikhs were killed in India, more than half of them in state capital Delhi, in the most barbaric way. 36 years later, the families of the victims are still struggling for justice and a life of dignity, and they've been denied that because of ongoing institutional apathy. So I'd like to first share my screen and take you through the exhibit that we've created as a part of our curating, practice at OMA. This is the homepage of the exhibit. I've called it The Victims of November because Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated on the last day of October, and killing of people effectively started from the 1st of November, from the morning of the 1st of November, 1984. The photograph that you see here shows 4 of hundreds of widows who are there in Delhi and elsewhere, who are really struggling for justice and a life of dignity. Below the photograph, you see there's an introduction to the exhibit, and I'm explaining briefly the context that I've shared with you already. Further down, you have a sound walk that you can access. It's about 4 minutes. It's an audio piece. It shows some still pictures. It captures my personal journey from a house in North Delhi where we lived back then to the Dudlu Castle Model School, which had been turned into a makeshift refugee camp. And the photograph that you see is the entrance of that school. Further down in this exhibit, you have these 6 boxes featuring 6 victims. On the extreme left, there is Mrs. Pritam Kaur, who lost her husband, who was a tailor and who was set on fire after a tire was thrown around his neck alongside petrol. Next to her, in the center of this screen, is Mrs. Maya Kaur. She became a widow at 16 and actually became one of the youngest widows of 1984. Had an 8-month-old daughter back then, who's 37 years old now, and lives in Delhi. Then there is this lady, Mrs. Popri Kaur, 70-year-old, who clearly blames a member of parliament of the Congress party at that time, Mr. Sajjan Kumar, who's actually serving a life term in a Delhi jail now. Then there is Mrs. Gopi Kaur, 65-year-old, also blames Sajjan Kumar, came face to face with him when the violence was being, unleashed on this locality in Sultanpuri in West Delhi. She, in fact, lost 35 members of her extended family. When you count cousins on both sides, her parents' side, her in-laws' side. And then you have a testimony from Mr. Trilochan Singh, who leads a retired life now, was member of parliament when Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated. He was press secretary to the President of India, Gyani Zail Singh, and also came under attack. Gyani Zail Singh, as some of you may know, was actually in Yemen at that time. And after Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated, he cut short his visit. Mr. Trilochan Singh was accompanying him from the Delhi airport. Then they drove in a cavalcade not to Rashtrapati Bhavan, not to the presidential palace, but to All India Institute of Medical Sciences, where Mrs. Gandhi's body lay. So that was the priority. The president was according to Mrs. Gandhi that he wanted to visit her first before going home. In the 5-mile, maybe 6-mile journey from the airport to the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, his car was about a mile away from All India Institute when the president's car was attacked. Now, he's supposed to be the president of India, supreme commander of the armed forces. He had a military escort. There was a cavalcade. There was an ambulance. All these cars of his staff, including Mr. Trilochan Singh, were in that cavalcade. So Mr. Trilochan Singh's car was a separate car, and somebody threw a burning stick inside. And his driver had the presence of mind to pick it up and fling it before the car caught fire. So Mr. Trilochan Singh survived. Later on, Mr. Trilochan Singh became first the vice chairman and then the chairman of the Minority Commission of India, and continued to serve in the Rajya Sabha for 2 terms. And on the extreme right, you see the testimony of Pritpal Singh, who was a pharmacist in North Delhi, whose pharmacy was ransacked and partially burnt. But he stayed on and re-established himself at the same place, though he did not expand his work much. In fact, in the first exhibit that I had on Friday, we had two of the narrators in this Zoom room because it was convenient at that time. It's 2:30 a.m. in India, so I couldn't possibly bring them in today. But both of them spoke about what exactly they went through. And when I was talking to Mrs. Pritam Kaur's son, Kirpal Singh, I asked him what was bothering him the most. What is it that's hurting the victims the most? And he said, what is hurting the victims is lack of justice. And I had given him choices between whether it was lack of justice, it was lack of, governmental support, resources, education, housing, etc. So clearly, he said it was lack of justice that still hurts them. For those who are not familiar with the context, I provided a background and context note on the website. There's a timeline, there's a bibliography, there are the usual avenues of contact information about the curator, and there's a feedback avenue. When you click on the feedback avenue, you will find a question that I've raised, which is, where were you when Mrs. Indira Gandhi was killed? That could be a starting point of a conversation and for the visitors to engage with the exhibit and the excerpts of oral histories that I've presented here. I also want to click on one of these boxes to take you to one individual page of one narrator to tell you how to access this exhibit. At the bottom of each individual narrator's page, you have the migration map, you have the oral history excerpt in the audio form, in the video form, and in the transcript form for those who can't access audio or video for any reason. The migration map is supposed to be tracing the displacement of each of the narrators. And I'm going to continue to follow this format for the new narrators that I'll add. This, for example, is Mrs. Pritam Kaur's trajectory of movement. She was in Sultanpuri in West Delhi when her house was attacked and husband was killed. From there, she moved to a camp nearby in an area called Piragadi. And from there, she moved to her brother's house in Raghubir Nagar, also in West Delhi. And from there, she went away to Ludhiana in Punjab, which is some 175 miles away from there. And then came back to a resettlement colony called Tilak Vihar, which if you search on the Google Maps, all you have to write is widow colony. This is how that colony is referred, because there are hundreds of widows who were given one-room flats, one-room apartments, and they continue to be there and, carry on with their lives. I also want to play one of the testimonies, an excerpt from one of the testimonies.
ਸਾਰੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਘਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੱਚੇ ਸੀ। ਮੁੰਡਾ ਮੇਰਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਹੈ, ਉਹ ਮੋਤੀ ਨਗਰ ਕੰਮ ਤੇ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਸਿੱਖਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ। ਉਹਨੇ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਈ ਛੱਡ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਸੀ, ਮਤਲਬ 9ਵੀਂ ਪਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਛੱਡ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਪਾਪਾ ਮੈਂ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਾਂਗਾ ਤੇ ਠੀਕ ਹੈ। ਉਹ ਮੋਤੀ ਨਗਰ ਚਲਾ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ। ਆਪਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਘਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੈਠੇ ਸੀ, ਮੇਰੇ ਬੱਚੇ, ਮੈਂ, ਮੇਰੇ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ। ਤੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕਿ ਇੰਦਰਾ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਨੂੰ ਗੋਲੀ ਲੱਗੀ, ਇੰਦਰਾ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਨੂੰ ਗੋਲੀ ਲੱਗੀ, ਕੋਈ ਗੋਲੀ ਲੱਗੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਮਾਰੀ ਗੋਲੀ। ਸਾਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਕੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ। ਆਪਣੇ ਘਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੇਰਾ ਮਾਮਾ ਦਾ ਮੁੰਡਾ ਸੀ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਆ ਗਿਆ ਤੇ ਹੋਰ ਵੀ ਸੀ ਗਵਾਂਢੀ ਸਾਰੇ ਕੇ ਇੰਦਰਾ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਨੂੰ ਗੋਲੀ ਲੱਗੀ, ਪਤਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀ ਹੋਣਾ ਕੀ ਨਹੀਂ। ਤੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਟੈਲੀਵਿਜ਼ਨ ਸੀ, ਆਪਾਂ ਸਮਾਚਾਰ ਹੀ ਵੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ। ਵੇਖਦੇ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਆਏ ਮਾਰਨ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਸਾਰੇ ਗਏ, ਬਈ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿਉਂ ਆਏ ਮਾਰਨ, ਕੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ? ਤੇ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰਾ ਸਾੜਾਂਗੇ। ਫਿਰ ਸਾਰੇ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਗਏ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਹਥਿਆਰ ਸੀ, ਕਿਰਪਾਨਾਂ ਸੀ, ਡੰਡੇ ਸੀ, ਜੋ ਵੀ ਹੱਥ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਇਆ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਗਏ। ਤੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਘਰਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਓ, ਪੁਲਿਸ ਸੀ ਨਾਲ, ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਘਰਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਓ, ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਕੁਛ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਹੇਗਾ। ਹਥਿਆਰ ਖੋਲ ਲਿੱਤੇ, ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਘਰਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਆ ਗਏ ਬੇਟੇ। ਫਿਰ ਇਹਨੇ 10 ਮਿੰਟਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਫਿਰ ਪੂਰਾ ਪੂਰਾ ਝਿਮਲਾ ਕੋਈ 50-60 ਬੰਦਾ फिर आ गया। आगे सज्जन कुमार, पीछे पुलिस वाले, पीछे भीड़ बेटा, सारे आ गए। फिर गुरुद्वारे बाबा ने पन्ने फाड़े, ਉਹਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਥੁੱਕ ਸੱਟਣ, ਉਹ ਕਰਨ। ਫਿਰ ਸਾਰੇ ਗਏ ਕਿ ਇੰਦਰਾ ਗਾਂਧੀ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦੀ ਮਾਂ ਸੀ, ਤੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਕਿਉਂ ਉਹ ਕਰਦੇ ਪਏ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਦਰਬਾਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਵਿੱਚ, ਤੇ ਪੱਲੇ ਫਾੜਦੇ ਪਏ ਹੋ, ਥੁੱਕ ਸੜਦੇ ਪਏ ਹੋ, ਉਹ ਕਰਦੇ ਪਏ ਹੋ, ਇਹ ਕਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ? ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਨਹੀਂ, ਉਧਰੋਂ ਭਜਾਇਆ। ਉਧਰੋਂ ਭਜਾ ਕੇ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਨਾਲ ਡੰਡੇ ਖੋਲ ਦਿੱਤੇ, ਮਾਰ ਮਾਰ ਕੇ। ਫਿਰ ਬੜੇ ਗੱਡੀ ਸੀ, ਮੇਰੀ ਗੱਡੀ ਖੜੀ ਸੀ ਬਾਹਰ, ਉਦੋਂ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੌੜ ਕੇ ਆਏ, ਗੱਡੀ ਨੂੰ ਸਾੜ ਦਿੱਤਾ, ਪੈਟਰੋਲ ਪਾ ਕੇ ਗੱਡੀ ਨੂੰ ਸਾੜਿਆ। ਇੱਕ ਕਮਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅੱਗ ਪਾਈ, ਤੇ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਗੱਡੀ ਨੂੰ ਬੁਝਾ। ਮੈਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਬਹਿ ਜਾਓ, ਫਿਰ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਆ, ਇੰਨੀ ਭੀੜ ਹੈ, ਮੈਂ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਗੱਡੀ ਨੂੰ ਬੁਝਾਵਾਂਗੀ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਬਹਿ ਜਾ, ਸੜ ਜਾਣ ਦੇ, ਤਾਂ ਗੱਡੀ ਸੜ ਜਾਣ ਦੇ। ਤੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਬੱਚੇ, ਮੇਰੇ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ ਪਲੰਗ ਸੀ ਅੰਦਰ खोल के, डबल पलंग से बच्चे ने 5 बच्चों अंदर सुला दिता पलंग दे अंदर। सरदार जी ने थल्ले बाड़ दिता पलंग दे। 2 बूहे से मेरे कोने का मकान से, मैं बाहर खड़ी हो गया, दौड़ के रो रही हूँ। सज्जन कुमार ने कहने लगी, मैं तो भाई साहब हमारा क्या कसूर है, मेरी गाड़ी जला दी, मेरे घर में आग लगा दी, बच्चे पता नहीं मेरे कहाँ है। ਤੇ ਉਹਦਾ ਕੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਿ ਮਾਰੋ ਸਰਦਾਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਰੋ, ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਸੱਪ ਹੈ, ਬਚ ਜਾਣਗੇ, ਫਿਰ ਡੰਗ ਮਾਰਨਗੇ। ਭਾਈ ਰੋਂਦੇ ਰੋਂਦੇ ਕੀ ਕਰੀਏ, ਸਾਰਾ ਦਿਨ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਭੁੱਖੇ ਪਿਆਸੇ, ਨਾ ਪਾਣੀ ਨਾ ਕੁਛ, ਸਾਰਾ ਦਿਨ ਕੱਟਿਆ। ਫਿਰ ਸ਼ਾਮੀ ਫਿਰ ਉਹੀ ਅੱਗ। ਕਿੱਥੇ ਜਾਈਏ, ਕਿਹਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਜਾਈਏ? ਫਿਰ ਸਾਡੇ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਗੋਰਖੇ ਸੀ। 5 ਵਜੇ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਤਾਂ ਮੋੜ ਮਤਲਬ ਘਟਿਆ, ਇਹ ਗੋਰਖਾ ਆ ਗਿਆ। ਸੜ ਜਾਣ ਪਿੱਛੋਂ ਦਾ ਮਤਲਬ ਬਹੁਤ ਚੰਗਾ ਸੀ ਬੰਦਾ। ਇਹ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿੱਥੇ ਹੋ? ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਤਾਂ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਚੁੱਕਿਆ ਪਿਆ, ਮੇਰੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਤਾਂ ਅੰਦਰ ਹੈ ਲੁਕੇ ਹੋਏ ਪਿਲੰਗ ਵਿੱਚ, ਮੈਂ ਕੀ ਕਰਾਂ, ਨਾ ਪਾਣੀ ਨਾ ਰੋਟੀ, ਸਾਰਾ ਦਿਨ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਸਾਰੀ ਰਾਤ ਹੋ ਗਈ, ਕੀ ਕਰਾਂ? ਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਕਰੋ, ਇੱਕ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਕੱਢੋ, ਮੇਰੇ ਘਰ ਆ ਜਾਣਗੇ। ਪਿੱਛੇ ਸੀ, ਇੱਕ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਕੱਢੋ। 5 ਬੱਚੇ ਕੱਢ ਦਿੱਤੇ, ਮੈਂ ਤੇ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ ਰਹਿ ਗਏ, ਬੱਚੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਚਲੇ ਗਏ। ਮੇਰੇ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ ਤੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਨੰਦੋ ਹੀ ਸੀ, ਇੱਕ ਭੈਣ ਬਣੀ ਹੋਈ ਸੀ ਮੇਰੀ, ਉਹਦੇ ਕਮਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ 5 ਸਰਦਾਰ, ਇੱਕ ਮੇਰਾ ਸਰਦਾਰ, 4 ਹੋਰ ਸੀ, ਬੱਚੇ ਵੱਖਰੇ ਸੀ। ਫਿਰ ਉਹਨੇ ਕਹਿ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਕਮਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਹੈ, ਨਹੀਂ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਹੈ। ਉਸ ਕਮਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅੱਗ ਲਾ ਦਿੱਤੀ, ਕਮਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਮੈਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਸੀ, ਬੱਚੇ ਵੱਖਰੇ, ਮੈਂ ਵੱਖਰੀ, ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ ਵੱਖਰੇ। ਤੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਕੱਢ ਕੇ ਲਿਆ ਤੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ ਦੀਆਂ ਲੱਤਾਂ ਤੋੜ ਕੇ ਪੈਟਰੋਲ ਪਾਇਆ, ਮੂੰਹ ਸਾੜ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਦੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਨਾ ਮਾਰੋ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਮਾਰਨਾ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਚੱਲ ਕੇ ਮਾਰੋ। ਮੈਨੂੰ ਵਾਲ ਸੀ ਜੂੜਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ, ਵਾਲ ਫੜ ਕੇ ਚੌਕ ਸੀ, ਉੱਤੇ ਚੌਕ ਤੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਲੰਬਾ ਪਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਫਿਰ ਗੋਰਖੇ ਦੇ ਘਰ, ਕਿ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਬੱਚੇ। ਉਹ ਗੋਰਖਾ ਕਹਿਣ ਲੱਗਾ ਵਿਚਾਰਾ ਕਿ ਮੇਰੀ ਬੀਬੀ ਨੂੰ ਬੱਚਾ ਹੋਣ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਬੈਠਾ ਹੈ, ਮੇਰਾ ਬੂਹਾ ਨਾ ਤੋੜੋ। ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਹੈ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ 10 ਬੱਚੇ ਸੀ, ਉਸ ਕਮਰੇ 10-15 ਬੱਚੇ ਸੀ। ਬਸ ਬੇਟਾ ਇੰਨੀ ਦੇਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਖਿਚਾ ਖਿਚੀ ਕਰਦੇ ਮਿਲਟਰੀ ਆ ਗਈ। ਮਿਲਟਰੀ ਆਈ ਤਾਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਬੱਚੇ 5 ਬੱਚੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਸੀ, 4 ਮੇਰੀ ਭੈਣ ਦੇ ਸੀ, ਹੋਰ 2-3 ਬੱਚੇ ਹੋਰ ਸੀ ਗਵਾਂਢੀਆਂ ਦੇ, ਸਾਰੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੀ। ਫਿਰ ਉਹ ਗੋਰਖੇ ਨੂੰ ਗੱਲ ਕੱਢਣ ਲੱਗੇ ਕਿ ਤੇਰੇ ਘਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੱਚੇ ਸੀ, ਤੂੰ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਕਿਉਂ ਨਹੀਂ? ਕਿ ਬੱਚੇ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਕਰਨਾ, ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਤੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਨਾ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਪਿਓ ਨੇ ਤੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਨਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ, ਤੇ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਕਰਨਾ। ਰੋਂਦੇ ਰੋਂਦੇ ਬੇਟਾ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਸਾਰਾ ਦਿਨ ਗਿਆ। ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਫਿਰ ਮਿਲਟਰੀ ਪਾਰਕਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਿਠਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਚਲੋ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਚਲੋ। ਹੁਣ ਕਿੱਥੇ ਜਾਈਏ, ਕਿੱਥੇ। ਫਿਰ ਜਦੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ, ਥਾਣੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ, ਜਦੋਂ ਵੇਖਿਆ ਮੇਰੇ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ, ਮੇਰੇ ਤਾਂ ਹੋਸ਼ ਬੇਟੇ ਉੱਥੇ, ਮੇਰੇ ਤਾਂ ਹੱਥ ਪੈਰ ਠੰਡੇ ਹੋ ਗਏ। ਤੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਅਜੇ ਉੱਠੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕਮਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕਮਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੱਚੇ, ਮੇਰੇ ਤਾਂ ਹੱਥ ਪੈਰ ਠੰਡੇ ਹੋ ਗਏ। ਹੁਣ ਲੱਭਾ ਮੇਰਾ ਆਦਮੀ ਵੀ ਗਿਆ, ਮੇਰੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਕਿੱਥੇ, ਬੱਚੇ ਤਾਂ ਲੱਭਾ ਕਿੱਥੇ ਬੱਚੇ। ਤੇ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਵਾਲੇ ਫੜ ਫੜ ਕੇ ਗੱਡੀਆਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਿਠਾਉਣਗੇ, ਗੱਡੀਆਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਿਠਾਉਣਗੇ। ਮੇਰੀ ਨਨਾਣ ਸੀ, ਉਹਦਾ ਜੇਠ ਸੀ, ਕਿ ਮਾਸੀ ਤੇਰੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਕਿੱਥੇ ਹਨ। ਮੈਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਪਤਾ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਬੇਟੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਕਿੱਥੇ हैं। और मैं रोई जा, मेरे हाथ पैर ठंडे बिल्कुल, कुछ भी नहीं, ना कपड़े पाए हुए, ना कोई चुन्नी, ना कोई कुछ, सर्दी ना उसी। मैंने बोला मैंने कि अच्छा तू गड्डी विच तां बैठ। मैं कहा मैं गड्डी विच तां बैठांगी जदों मेरे बच्चे आउणगे मेरे कोल, मैं तां बैठांगी गड्डी विच। फिर पुलिस वाला मिलिटरी सी कि भाई अजे एक गड्डी तुसीं भेजो, ते इहदे बच्चे नहीं मिलते पे, बच्चे तो वेख ले कितने आदमी मार दिता, बच्चे तो वेख। फिर बेटे मेरे 5 बच्चे कट के ले आए। फिर वड्डा मुंडा सी मेरा, उन्हें की कीता, जो पापा दी देखी इस तरह हालत, उन्हें साथ दिता, और नाम ते पछाणिया सी, बस नाम लिखिया सी बाजू ते, नाम ते पछाण, वार लंबे लंबे सी, खुले बस वार। फिर बेटे ने की कीता, होर लोकां दे गलियां विच चार पाइयां सी, लकड़ां सी, कपड़े गंदे सी, ਉਹ ਪਾ ਕੇ ਪਾਪਾ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਉਹਨੇ ਫਿਰ ਆਗ ਲਾ ਦਿੱਤੀ। आग ला के मैं क्या घना घबरा के तू चल गड्डी में बैठ, और तेरे पापा कितने, तेरे पापा आ रहा है अजय, मैंने मतलब वो कि पापा आ रहा है, तो मम्मी तो गड्डी में बैठ जा, पापा आ जाएगा नहीं तो गड्डी में तो बैठ। मैं कहा तेरे नाल, बेटा मेरा छोटा 2 साल का सी। फिर बेटे ले गए थाने में। अज गल्लां तो बोल ही जांदियां ने, अद्धी गल्लां तो बोल ही जांदियां कि माइंड इस तरह हो गया। हुण जदों गोरखे दे घर विच सी ना, मैं पानी नहीं सी, बेटा सी मेरा 2 साल का, रात जो उत्थे कड्ढी गया ते बच्चा मंगया मम्मा बो, मम्मा बो पानी कित्थों लवा। घड़े दी ढक्कनी सी टुट्टी हुई, वो पई सी बेटा, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ खुद बच्चे ਦਾ पेशाब करवाया, ਉਹਦਾ पेशाब करवा के बच्चे ਦਾ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਚੁੰਨੀ ਲਾ ਕਰਕੇ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਹੋਠ ਗਿੱਲੇ ਕੀਤੇ ਸੀ। ਕੀ ਕਰੇ ਮੇਰਾ ਬੱਚਾ, ਉਹਨੇ ਹੋਠ ਗਿੱਲੇ ਕੀਤੇ ਸੀ।
I know it is very, very difficult to grapple with this trauma, but that question has constantly confronted me. How do you record these testimonies and not reopen the wounds of the victims, the survivors, the narrators? I know that 2 minutes to go. Professor Zoe West has class at 5:30. So Professor West, I just want to ask you, what, if anything, the world should have done back then? What can it still do? Or is it a lost cause?
I think I was actually going to ask you when you said before that the people you spoke with said that what was missing and what was most important was justice. And so I was going to ask that of you, of what their idea of justice was. I think you've shared these really important, difficult narratives, and I think part of the value of that is understanding what their vision of justice looks like. And I am very sorry that I have to leave to go
No, I understand. Now. Thank you for making the time. I'll address the question you raised. That's come up in all my conversations with about a dozen narrators that I have recorded so far. And the sense of hurt is greater because if there were 5,000 murders, which there were, there haven't even been 50 major convictions. So these people have been going to the courts, protesting, squatting before judges, politicians, civil society, but there is no response that they receive. It's an annual event now. When the first week of November comes, they hold prayer meetings for the family members that they lost. And one of the narrators, Mrs. Preetham Kaur's son, told me on Friday, he said, everybody is eating food. It's not about eating food anymore. The kids have grown up and, they've got kids now. So the survivors have grandchildren. So they are able to fend for themselves as far as basic necessity is concerned. Most of them, there are some who are really on the margins who definitely need help, but justice has been elusive. And in another conversation, somebody said, is there a political will to dispense justice? I didn't want to argue in that conversation, but my response has been for a long time that a life of dignity is guaranteed in the Constitution. And if that is the case, then it should not require political will to secure justice if somebody has violated somebody's space or done something illegal. Please correct me if you think I'm wrong. I see Nisa here. Thank you so much. I've grown up on your writing, and I definitely, would like to understand how you're receiving these testimonies, and what is your sense of how justice will be served?
I won't dare to try to answer the question of how justice can be served, but I think I'm still recovering from the power of what I just heard, and I wasn't able to be there on Friday, and I guess I'm wondering what they said, what it meant to them to have this project, exist now, and to have their their testimonies, be a part of this work, and have us listening to this have this conversation happen, and have have it be out in the world, and the work that you're doing.
They were very, Nisa, they were very cooperative. They recognized that I've known them for a very long time in a minor way. I didn't have the loss of life that they have had. I was lucky to survive and rescued by the army. So to that extent, they know that I'm trying to document, using the tools of oral history, what they have gone through for future generations. So they are very cooperative. They make time, they open, their spaces. In spite of COVID, I was able to meet them, take the equipment inside, record, with a camera person, a production assistant, etc. That space they've created. And they know that this is being done. They are on board, even on the excerpts. So they know that, and I promised them, keeping in line with the ethical framework of oral history, that this is my objective. This is their stories as much as they are mine. That, if they don't want them used, they will not be used. If they withdraw, the consent, I will not press with their use at all. They understand that. They trust me also. So to that extent, they would like this, these testimonies to be recorded. And I'm, trying to do a competent job of it by listening to them more rather than what I used to do earlier as a journalist, that you go with a set format of your story in your mind, and you want a quote or a bite, and you want to validate what you're trying to pitch in your story, and they come in, they speak, and then they are forgotten. And they have had those encounters all the time. They talk about these kind of annual stories that media does, local media, national media, international media. So, but like I said, they definitely, I gave them a choice. What is it? Is it resources? Is it, government support? Is it, money? Is it a house? Is it education? Is it justice? So they all said justice. And the theme that kept coming back in the conversation was that everybody knows. The courts know, the media knows, the politicians know, the lawmakers know. There were, about a dozen commissions of inquiry at different points of time. And the findings are there, the recommendations are there. Yet, like I said, if you don't, this gentleman, maybe I shouldn't call him a gentleman, this guy whom Mrs. Gopi Kaur holds responsible for the killings in her family, Sajjan Kumar. Sajjan Kumar was sent to jail 30 years after the episode occurred, and he's serving a life term now, and he's still trying to pull strings and get out somehow. He's already moved from, the high security prison in West Delhi, Tihad, to another, another prison in Northwest Delhi on the pretext of COVID infection. So he's obviously somebody still manipulating. It is true that the party is out of power. It's a different, political party, different constellation, which is holding the reins, but they have acknowledged it as a genocide. That's all they've done. They made lots of promises which are still sitting in the files. So the same question I'm asking, I see my Professor Mary Marshall here. Thank you, Professor Mary Marshall. Grateful you made the time. We are discussing what, if anything, the world could have done when it happened back then, and what could it still do, or is it a lost cause?
I certainly don't think it's a lost cause, because I find it that memory, this kind of memory with the care that you've collected it, will last for so long. I mean, I'm thinking of it today, the weight of it, where we have 4 Sikhs who were killed in a mass shooting this week. Our work after September 11th documented Sikhs who were confused with Muslims and others who were wrongfully accused in the aftermath. So I think everything you do to restore dignity is restoring power in some sense, and is removing stigma, which is starting to take apart the terrible, horrible, irrational prejudice that people internalize after they've been through such horrible events. So I think what you're doing is human rights work through oral history, through protecting testimony and releasing testimony in the most classical oral history human rights sense. I don't know if that was the question you were asking.
I was also asking if, when I talk about the developed world, I'm essentially referring to America, which is seen as a beacon of democracy, which is holding non-democracies to a certain standard of public conduct. And back in the day when 84 happened, you know, at least I'm not aware of any demarche that happened for these killings from the US to India. And is justice still possible? Do you think? That was a question.
Well, justice has to make a difference in the lives of those who suffered. So unless it can be directly given, I mean, unless it can somehow restore something that was lost, not life, of course, but a place in the world, a sense of safety, more protections. I mean, this is where the limits of world history are clear, you know, that we can listen to these stories, but what can we do to help seek justice? That is the question. So I think as long as they are alive, justice is still possible. But I don't know enough about the context that they're living in now to what it would take to bring about that justice, whether it's money, whether it's some kind of supports that are needed in the community, whether it's voice, you know, whether it's translating these voices into a larger forum at the UN, at The Hague. I mean, I think that to really reach its potential, art history has to be part of truth commissions, not necessarily with South Africa as the model, where there was no economic justice.
I'm definitely going to make the effort to, you know, create a kind of a convergence with decision makers, so they see value in supporting the paradigm of justice, whether by expediting cases in the courts or setting up, you know, more courts, and ensuring that the survivors who are, you know, who are in their 60s and 70s and 80s, a lot of them are very old and they are gradually withering away, that they have that kind of sense of justice, maybe closure of some kind. So in their lifetime, I'm going to make that effort definitely. Belinda's raised the hand.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. My question for you as a researcher is your coping mechanisms for getting through this work. Do you think that you've learned anything about yourself or about the human struggle that could help these victims from this point on? Just the journey that you've taken and how you deal with the pain. Is there anything that you learned that you could offer to them that you think might help?
Belinda, when I, discussed this subject with Dr. Amy in December of 2019, when I was in the US on a visit, I described to her, you know, what exactly it entailed. But I was still emotionally quite strong. When I went back to India and wrote my long form essay describing my own experience in 1984 as a college kid who was, you know, rescued along with his family by the Indian Army, by the Dogra Regiment of the Indian Army, then it opened a wound. And subsequently, when I started engaging with the narrators and, started setting up preparatory meetings with them, the pain started pouring out, and I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't handle it. So it slowed me down. And Dr. Amy, told me how to deal with it. And I've used those methods to kind of keep my sanity and keep going, because, this work has to be done. And one guy is not going to be able to do, 5,000 testimonies, which is what I'm trying to do, because there are hundreds of widows and there are thousands of families. You talk to any Sikh family anywhere, they have somebody affected anywhere in the world, So it's difficult, when you're transcribing, for example, you need to keep replaying and, going back and then playing again and going back and playing again. And then each time you hear it, there's a new dimension to it. There's a new trauma, so it has slowed me down. And I think slowing down is part of the response mechanism. When I can't take it anymore, I go away from my computer. I come back to it when I taken a walk, eaten something, diverted my mind by reading something else, listening to something else, music sometimes. So, the change that has occurred is, I thought I was very strong. I could do this, I could deal with this. But when I started engaging with the survivors, I couldn't cope with the pain. Is it a failure? Possibly. It's a human failure.
I disagree with the thought of failure, because you're this. So in that, to get to the point that you are. And I just want you to embrace that.
Belinda, my idea was that I was strong enough and I could do this. And I started doing this and I realized what an onerous task it is. So I am trying to cope. I'm saying it's a failure when I look at what I set out to do for myself. To that extent, I am not giving up. It's not a failure in that sense. It's, it slowed me down, but no, I'm not giving up. I'm sure I'll take a break. I'll do something else in the middle. I am going to keep at it because I always wanted to do it, and it is happening now, and it is happening under the guidance of the OMA program, which is what makes it worthwhile to continue. The question Professor Mary Marshall is put in the chat is, can you find others to do this with you? Yes, Professor Mary Marshall, my plan is to, do the first set of 20, 30, whatever, create the website, create a mechanism where under OMA supervision, I'm able to create a kind of training module and then impart the training to volunteers whom I can compensate and then involve them. And I have an example, to emulate, which is if you look at 1947 partition archive, which has been done by a lady whom I know personally quite well, Dr. Gunita Singh Bhalla in California. Gunita is a physicist, actually. She's a scientist who started, exploring her own family's history and found how they came from the other side of, the divided Punjab, which is now in Pakistan, and how they settled down. And then she created a program for herself and then involved volunteers. And she has done nearly 10,000 testimonies from both sides of the border. And she knows I'm doing this. She knows, I had a long conversation. I met her in Delhi. She was in Delhi in Feb of last year. So she has created a training module, and I've looked at that. And, after I've from the exhibit, I'm going to do the thesis. From the thesis, I'm alongside going to create the website. I'm going to add more resources that I want to add. For example, I want to create a legal tracker, a case tracker, where something happens in a case, all information should be available at one place. Where are we at in the additional cases against other politicians, So I want to add a case tracker. And once that framework is in place, I will add volunteers, That's the plan.
Great.
Dr. Amy, please.
Harpal, I'm just thinking more about what Mary Marshall said about how this kind of shows us some of the limits of oral history, and what you said about how the survivors keep saying everybody knows, everybody knows what happened, and nobody cares enough, or nobody's doing what needs to be done to create a meaningful justice. And thinking about the idea of you needing to slow down to be able to listen to people in the way that they need to be listened to, I think is such a victory, in fact, that it's not that what people need is to be, not for people to know, but for people to really hear them. And that you're only able to do that if you slow down enough to be able to, we've talked about like metabolizing what other people tell you, to like take the time for even like your body and your mind to take in really what you're hearing. So it's not a question so much, but I guess my question is, you said you came to me and I told you what to do. What did I tell you?
Yes, we're all wanting to hear that.
I really know the answers here. And so I'm curious to hear more. And I think people are curious in the chat too, like what those words of wisdom might have been.
When I came to you, I think that meeting took place. I asked for 15 minutes. You gave me 30 minutes. It became a 50-minute meeting, 3rd December, noon, at your office at Columbia University. And I described what I wanted to do. And your first question was, why oral history? So I said, these people have not been heard. They need to be heard in a lot more detail than journalism would afford or documentary would afford. So you said, yes, that's a good goal to start. Then the conversation was, you wanted me to crystallize the goals clearly. Is it deterrence? Is it justice? Is it memorialization? Is it compensation? What exactly is the goal? So I said, partly all of them. So, I still think that these goals are important, but can I sequence them? I need to debate that separately, and maybe do what the survivors immediately need. Focus on that first.
I'm thinking about, but hearing what has worked for you in terms of dealing with the pain. You said that when you came and talked to me about that you figured out, but it's so personal how someone deals with that. I'm just curious, like, what are some strategies that have worked for you?
When I was writing that 15-page long form sample that I submitted to you, the pain had started coming out of my pores, and it was happening in a context where East Delhi was watching similar violence, but it was a different community, different political party. And I still thought I was strong to deal with, the trauma of '84, and I had kind of recovered from it because so much time had passed. But then when you start talking to the narrators and, you don't even have to ask too many questions. They start sharing. And in one instance, I asked this lady, Maya Kaur, the young widow who became a widow at 16. I asked her, you were young. Did anybody all these years come to you and ask you what you've gone through? She said, nobody came. Nobody ever asked me anything. The first time I'm sitting down and talking to you, and you come through a reference, I trust you. So I'm talking to you and sharing what exactly happened, but nobody came. So, that had its own pain. And when I told you from Delhi subsequently that, pain was pouring out, and you asked me to guard against PTSD, and you said I could, connect you to medical resources if required. So I said, no, I don't think at this point I need medical resources. I just need guidance. And we decided to continue the conversation. And since then, I have transcribed them. I have edited them. I have, presented them, published, etc. Revisited, heard them. I mean, I must have heard these dozen testimonies that I've got at least 4 to 5 times each, which is several hours of listening, actually, because these are very long, interviews ranging from 39 minutes to 2 hours or 2 hours, 15 minutes. So is it going to consume me? No, I just need to pace myself, I think. And I should be okay. There is Anand is asking a question. Anand is my old colleague from TV Today Network. He still works there. He's the deputy editor of India Today TV. He said, and he's covered Punjab. He was the bureau chief for the state at Chandigarh. And he says, I myself interviewed many victims of 1984 while I worked in Punjab. These testimonies keep reminding me how the Indian judicial system has failed them, with many of the victims yet to get justice. Anand, we have 3 more minutes. Do you want to make a quick observation?
Well, yes, every time I listen to these victims of 84, wherever they are, particularly north of India, Delhi, Punjab, Western Uttar Pradesh, and all these years, we've covered so much about these victims. But yes, again and again, this question keeps popping up that, not enough has been done. We've seen that how the senior politicians like Sajjan Kumar, as you mentioned, some of them have already passed, they didn't get, to that point of justice, of that, really, became an example, overarching example for others not to do, and indulge in such kind of an act. So that is the, biggest point which keeps, popping up in my mind as to, these high and mighty politicians were able to get away with this easily, though Sajjan Kumar is languishing in jail now, but we all know for most time of his career, he was out of the jail. He enjoyed, his time as a member of parliament. So this is the big question that, these highly connected politicians were able to get away with this. And we still see the victims craving for justice, even today, after so many years, after decades have passed. That's the tipping point of our judicial system, which is very sad.
Thanks, Anand. Nisa, I want to ask you the last question. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you do this any differently than how I am doing it?
You flatter me with that question, Harpal. I mean, how could I answer that question, Harpal? But how would I do it any differently? No, I'm actually more than anything kind of humbled and amazed by the plans that you already have for what you plan to do next. Your idea to extend this to as a tracker for the court cases, to it seems to me that you're thinking on levels of who needs to hear this and why it needs to be heard. You know, you're thinking one, why the victims themselves might need to hear each other. You're thinking who else, you know, who could have the power to change it and what information they would need to be convinced. You know, you're even thinking about yourself, you know, across like different, you're thinking about different generations and who needs to remember it. I'm actually just awed by the number of levels that this project is already operating on. So, no, I mean, beyond what would I do differently, I'm wondering how can I learn from what you are already doing, to be honest. So, yeah.
Thank you, Nisa. I will need guidance. I will need kind of you know, support. I will need to kind of, you know, to keep all the tracks moving, and for them to make a difference to the survivors eventually, because that is my focus. Eventually, am I able to record them to a standard that Columbia will approve? Will it go into the archive for it to be accessible by future generations? And while that track operates, is there a way that I can compensate the narrators in terms of, you know, at least, you know, paying them for their time, and understanding the needs that they have? For example, you know, when I was in Delhi this time, I met Mrs. Preetham Kaur, and I had that in my mind because in the last conversation, she mentioned she was very badly off and she had difficulty supporting herself. So I, you know, went with an envelope, and she was very, very reluctant. So I said, you know, you keep calling me your son. You are 81 years old. You're my mother's age. Why would you refuse this? And, you know, she had tears in her eyes, and she blessed me, and I came back. And, you know, and she's opened doors for me to half a dozen other narrators. She's told them, he's like my son, you can talk to him. And they've opened their doors because I've recorded about 4 or 5 testimonies on this visit. So to that extent, I definitely want to continue to do that in my own way. And, you know, I'll share my plan with you that Dr. Amy approved in terms of creating a transparent mechanism, an organized method for help to reach them, because half the time the help kind of, you know, is waylaid by others. I don't want that to happen. I mean, it's an academic undertaking for me at this point of time, and it'll never become a political undertaking for me. I'm committed to that. So I think we are 3 minutes over the scheduled time. So I'd like to thank you, and I'm grateful you made the time to come. I'll keep you updated. There is a feedback avenue. You know how to reach me. Please let me have the feedback. I want to learn from each piece, you know, of comment that comes in, to be able to improve my approach, do what I'm doing better. And thank you very much. I'm grateful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Harpal, for letting us all learn from you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Grateful for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Amy.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Harpal's
you.
giving you way
Thank
too
you,
much
Harpal.
credit, just so y'all know.
Thank you so much for the work you have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Harpal.
Thank
Bye.
you. I'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Admire so much what you've done, okay? I can't wait to talk to you some more about it.
Thank you.